He thought he was marrying a plain, broken woman for convenience. But when she stepped into the lamplight, he realized she was hiding a fire that could burn down his entire world. The saloon doors groaned open, drawing every eye in the room as poker games stalled mid-hand and the clink of glasses went still. Men looked up, bracing for the familiar crackle of trouble, but relaxed when they saw it was only Elijah. Or so they assumed. He wasn't the man he used to be. Not since the day he buried his wife 4 years back. The whiskey had dried up in his life the same way the laughter had. Folks knew him as the quiet rancher from the southern ridge. Land rich, but soul poor, with more acres than friends and more cattle than words. He was a man of silence and steady hands, his grief packed down like snow in spring. But today there was no drink in his sights. Today he had come for a wife. At a far table, slouched and sour, sat Silas Crow. His bloodshot eyes and breath, like sour milk, announced him before his voice ever could. His coat hung in tatters, and his grin, half-formed, half-feral, set the bartender to scrubbing glasses with nervous precision. "You're late," Silas slurred, pushing a paper across the scarred wood. "She's outside. Says she don't care either way, long as it gets her off my back." Elijah remained standing. He read the document with a steady eye. His name, and beneath it, hers, Evelyn Darmoy, scrawled in handwriting too neat for the room they were in, but trembling at the edges. There was no dowry, no promises, just a cold, inked bargain. One woman in exchange for peace. A life traded like cattle. He nodded once. "Is she healthy?" he asked flatly. Silas spat on the floor and sneered. "She breathes, don't she? Don't expect much. She's got the face of a fence post and the mood of a kicked mule." Elijah's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. He placed a thick envelope on the table. Payment, final and full. Silas snatched it up greedily, like a mutt thrown a bone. The door creaked once more, and a figure stepped in from the gathering dusk. She was wrapped in a worn shawl, face veiled, her boots caked with trailed dust. Her hands were clasped in front of her, still and tense, like someone awaiting punishment. She didn't meet the gaze of her father, nor Elijah's. She just stood there, a shadow in the lamplight. "That's your prize," Silas said with a smug lift of his drink. Elijah turned toward her. "You agree to this?" he asked, voice even. She gave a small nod, once. That was all he needed. He offered his arm in formality, but she brushed past him without a glance, stepping outside like a wraith slipping through the walls of the living. They rode back to the ranch under a sky streaked with crimson, the sun dipping low and bleeding red across the horizon, as if the earth itself were wounded. She sat side saddle on a spare horse, rigid and unmoving, her body a stark contrast to the fluid motion of the horse beneath her. Her spine was stiff, taut with a tension that matched the oppressive silence hanging between them. Elijah didn't try to break it. He didn't ask questions or offer reassurance. There were no words of comfort, no attempts to ease the weight of the situation. He wasn't looking for conversation, nor was he seeking love or companionship. What he wanted, what he needed, was simply someone to share the space, someone who could tend to the house, cook, mend, and help keep the place from falling into ruin. That was all. The land stretched out before them, dark and endless, rolling like waves beneath the gathering night. The air had a chill to it, and the silence felt too thick, almost oppressive, as they rode on in the fading light. By the time they reached the ranch, the last of the day's light was all but swallowed by the vastness of the night. The ranch was small, humble, just as Elijah had kept it. Low, distant hills loomed in the distance, and the barn stood worn and weathered, its wood cracking with age. A lone hen scratched at the dirt of the chicken coop, a quiet symbol of the solitude that hung in the air. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and soap, fragrance that clung to the place, an attempt at comfort in the starkness of the life Elijah had carved out. He had tried to make the house decent, at least. 2 simple bedrooms. He pointed toward the smaller one. "You could take that. Sheets are fresh. Water's in the basin. I'll wake you at dawn, he said, his voice soft, yet strangely distant. She didn't respond, only nodded slightly, her movement as silent as the rest of her. She disappeared into the room, as if fading into the shadows that filled the house, her presence lingering in the air but leaving no trace in the space. Elijah remained standing in the parlor, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the door she had just passed through. He couldn't quite place what he felt, or even what he had expected. What did one expect from such an arrangement? The land was quiet, the house empty, and yet something heavy had settled in his chest, a quiet ache that he couldn't name. It was a sensation that crawled deeper than the usual ache of solitude. It was something in the way she walked, the way she never looked at him, something that left a hollow space between them, a note too distant and too still. He had no idea where this strange feeling had come from or what it meant, but it was there, thick and unspoken, hovering in the air like the silence itself. Morning arrived quicker than expected, brushing the sky with a pale light that crept over the hills and spilled into the ranch. Elijah stepped out expecting stillness, but she was already awake. He spotted her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled past her elbows, fingers digging into the parched earth. In the daylight, she looked changed, not soft, not classically pretty, not the painted kind of beauty whispered about in town, but there was something arresting in her angles, in the precise, deliberate way she moved. Her face remained hidden beneath the shadow of her bonnet, but her presence felt sharpened, distilled to something real. "You didn't have to start this early," Elijah said, watching her rise to her feet with easy strength. "Soil's hard," she replied evenly, brushing her palms on her skirt. "Needs water." Her voice was calm and measured, not submissive but chosen, like someone long acquainted with silence who had decided to keep it. "You've worked a farm before?" he asked. She gave a short nod. "More than my father ever did." The corner of Elijah's mouth twitched, almost a smile, before he looked away. In the days that followed, she folded herself into the rhythm of the ranch without complaint or question. She cooked simply but with care, meals that filled the belly without fuss. She mended torn shirts with stitches straight as fence lines, fixed a leaning post without being told, moved through the house like she belonged nowhere, but had made peace with staying. The pistol above the mantel didn't go unnoticed by her either. She checked it once, quietly, like she'd done it before. The ranch hands watched from a distance, murmuring over their cards and chores. In what she seemed, one said, "She's got steel under that shawl." But no one approached her. She kept to herself. No idle talk, no laughter, no questions. Her silence wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was the kind of quiet that came from surviving too much for too long. One evening, Elijah found her sitting on the porch, elbows on her knees, eyes fixed on the moon rising over the fields. He joined her, leaning against the post, letting the stillness settle before speaking. "You don't say much," he offered. She didn't look at him. "Don't have much worth saying." Her voice was soft this time, not harsh, just tired. He studied her profile, wondering how much she carried behind those quiet words. "Your father said you had a temper," he said, not unkindly. She turned her head, slowly, and for the first time he caught her eyes in full. They were darker than he expected, not with rage, but with weariness, like wells that had been drawn from too often. "My father sold me," she said plainly. "What kind of temper would you have?" Elijah looked away, the shame curling in his chest. "Fair point," he muttered. In the days that followed, Elijah began to notice more. It wasn't anything she said. She still kept her words few, but it was in the quiet details she left behind, in the subtle shifts that spoke volumes. He noticed the soft hum that escaped her lips as she washed dishes, the sound barely rising above the clatter of water, as if she were lost in a thought too private to share, a memory too fragile to hold on to. There was a quiet strength in the way she moved, in the way she went about her chores without complaint, as if every action had its purpose, every task its meaning. He saw how her shoulders stiffened when boots thudded too loudly on the porch, how her body reacted to each footstep like a person trained to anticipate danger, a reflex learned through years of survival. Then there were the scars, the thin, pale lines that crossed her wrists when her sleeves slipped back, old and deliberate, marks that told a story of their own. They were not the kind of wounds that were easily explained or excused, not the kind of thing one could brush aside without a second thought. She never mentioned them, never offered an explanation, and Elijah never pressed her for one. But each time he caught a glimpse of those marks, something deep inside him clenched, as if each scar were a reminder of a history she carried silently with her, a history of being broken in ways too deep to heal fully. Yet, as much as the scars spoke of pain, there was something else in her that Elijah couldn't ignore. There was fire left in her. It was in the way she held herself, the way she stood her ground when the world tried to push her down. There was a fierceness in her that went unnoticed by many, a quiet, unyielding strength that refused to bend, that refused to be broken further. She wasn't what the town had made her out to be, nor what her father had tried to shape her into. She wasn't ugly or cruel. She wasn't the victim people expected her to be. She was a woman who had survived the worst, who had learned how to exist in a world that tried to own her, and who had come out the other side with something that no one could take from her. Not pity, not fear, not even the remnants of the past. There was a defiance in her now, a refusal to be anything but herself. And that, more than anything, was what Elijah had begun to see. One evening, after spending most of the day on horseback checking the far fence line, Elijah returned to the ranch with a familiar weight of dust on his boots and exhaustion in his bones. He expected the usual quiet, dim light, maybe cold bread, but the parlor greeted him with something different. A soft, amber glow flickered from the oil lamp on the table. The scent of rosemary and roasted meat drifted through the air, grounding him like a memory he didn't know he missed. The table was set neatly, bread still warm, a roast carefully seasoned, steam curling up in delicate tendrils. She stood in the corner, apron wrinkled, hands drying on a cloth, eyes steady. And for the first time, she met his gaze directly. No veil, no sidelong glance, just quiet honesty. "I figured you were tired," she said, voice even. He gave a small nod, caught off guard by the gesture and the fact that she'd noticed. "You work hard," she continued. "I see that." He hesitated before answering, the words landing softer than he expected. "You do too." She held his eyes for a breath longer than was comfortable, long enough that something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, not affection, but a shift, a recognition, the fragile beginning of trust. Later that night, when the house had settled into its usual stillness, Elijah stepped into the parlor for coffee, and the sight stopped him cold. She stood by the window, lamplight outlining her figure, and for the first time, she had removed the veil. Her dark hair hung loose and freshly washed, catching the light in muted waves. The bonnet and shawl were gone. There was no barrier now, no fabric between her and the room. She wore only a simple dress, plain as the prairie. Yet she carried it with a quiet dignity that made the air feel different. She wasn't beautiful in the polished, doll-eyed way people in town spoke of, but there was something unshakable in her bearing, something that felt more permanent than charm. Regal almost, and at the same time, her eyes held a shadow, grief not fully buried, fear not yet spent. She turned toward him slowly, her hands at her sides. "Are you surprised?" she asked, her voice softer now, laced with something he couldn't name. Elijah cleared his throat, unsure where to look. "A little," he admitted. She didn't flinch. "Because I'm not what he said I was?" He shook his head and set the mug down on the table with care. "No," he said, voice low, "because I was ready to live with a ghost." Her eyes dropped to the floor, the smallest breath escaping her lips. "But you're not a ghost," he added. She looked up again, and for the first time, There was something new in her eyes, not just pain, but the edges of hope. "Not anymore," she whispered. Outside, thunder rolled low over the plains, distant but steady, like the sound of something old beginning to stir. Inside, Elijah stood still, a man unaccustomed to possibility. For the first time in years, he wondered what it might be like if silence wasn't the only thing left to share. The next morning, the wind held a different weight, thin and sharp as ever, but layered with something quieter, something that hinted at movement beneath the frostbitten ground. Spring hadn't yet arrived, not fully, but there was a sense that the earth was beginning to shift, to breathe again. Elijah lingered by the kitchen doorway longer than usual, coffee cooling in his hand, ears tuned to the familiar rhythm of the house. But there were no soft steps on the floorboards, no clatter from the stove. He stepped outside and found her already at work, bonnet gone, braids swinging low against her back like a dark pendulum. She moved with assurance, sleeves pushed up, lips murmuring a quiet count as she gathered eggs and checked latches. "Something's been getting under the fence," she said without looking up as he approached. He crouched beside her as she pointed to the mesh where a few strands of fur clung stubbornly. "You sure?" he asked. "Prints are too wide for a raccoon. Might be a fox. Might not." Her voice was steady, but the implication hung in the air like the cold. "Maybe a man," she added. He looked at the tracks, then at her. She was right. And in her expression, beneath the focus and calm, there was something else, an ease with threat, a practiced awareness. He saw it clearly then. She had lived with danger before and learned not to flinch. "You ever hunt?" he asked, eyes still on the prints. "Used to shoot," she said, brushing her hands on her apron, before he took the rifle away. "Your father?" She hesitated only a moment. "Or the judge who paid him?" The words landed without emotion, flat and final. Elijah didn't press her for more. She'd offer enough. That day, without prompting, she asked for tools from the barn. With Hannah Vale's quiet help, she reinforced the chicken wire, hammered the loosened step on the porch, and inspected the feed bins. She worked with quiet focus, not for show, not with the weariness of obligation, but with purpose, as though building something she hoped might stay upright this time. Elijah watched her from a distance, trying to determine where necessity ended and choice began. The answer wasn't clear, but he knew this much. She was choosing to stay busy, choosing to fix rather than wait. By the end of the week, she had taken over the ranch ledgers. One evening, Elijah flipped through the pages, pausing at the clean, neat rows of numbers. "You're using decimal spacing," he said, surprised by the precision. "I taught arithmetic 4 years back in Cedar Bluff," she replied without looking up. "That's a proper town," he remarked, brows raising. She gave a half shrug. "Was. Until the judge found it easier to shame me than hear no." Her voice was sharp, but it carried no edge of self-pity. She said it like she was done carrying the weight of that man's cruelty. Yet, as she turned the page, Elijah noticed her fingers trembled slightly, the only betrayal of what lay beneath her calm. He didn't push, didn't ask. He simply nodded once and let her keep turning the pages, one careful line at a time. That night, they found themselves on the porch again, drawn by the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. The sky stretched wide above them, scattered with stars like someone had spilled salt across a black tablecloth. Evelyn sat curled into the chair, coffee cup nestled in her hands, legs tucked beneath her with the ease of someone who no longer flinched at the dark. There was a different air about her now, still guarded, still quiet, but no longer braced for the next blow. After a long pause, her voice broke the stillness. "You think folks believe everything they hear?" she asked, her tone casual, but her gaze fixed on the horizon. Elijah nodded slowly. "In towns like Cedar Bluff?" "Yeah, truth slower than a lie." She inhaled, steady and deep. "I wasn't his," she said. "Not ever. But truth doesn't sell as fast as gossip." Her words didn't carry defensiveness. There was no plea in her voice. She wasn't asking to be believed. She was offering him a knowledge like a lit match and letting him decide what to do with it. Elijah turned toward her, really looking this time. She didn't shrink from his gaze. She was letting him see, not just the damage, but the strength it took to name it. She shifted slightly, setting the cup down beside her. "What brought you here?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost unsure. Elijah stared into the distance, the memories still too close in some places, too far in others. "My wife died," he said. "Typhoid. She was strong, smarter than me. Ran the books, ran the house. Then one day, her hands just stopped holding on." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Evelyn nodded like she understood. "And now you're just surviving." He exhaled. Something like that. She looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of her sleeve. "I want more than that," she said, almost to herself. "But I don't know if I still know how to want things." The wind picked up then, brushing across the porch and through the tall grass, carrying the scent of dust and early spring. Neither of them spoke after that. Some silences are best left whole. In the days that followed, the ranch settled into its rhythm. Animals fed at dawn, fences checked, a quiet trade made in town. The work grounded them both, gave shape to the days. But Elijah noticed the disturbances, small, strange things that didn't belong. Twice the gate had been left swinging open when he knew he'd latched it. Once the pulley rope on the well had been cut clean through. It wasn't wear and tear. It was deliberate, calculated. Evelyn noticed, too. One morning, while pouring water for the chickens, she spoke without looking up. "There's someone watching," she said, voice crisp, like wind slicing through pine trees. Elijah didn't ask how she knew. "You saw them," he asked instead. She shook her head. "No, but I feel it. Eyes. The kind that don't blink." He didn't laugh or brush her off. A man like Elijah had learned when to trust instincts, and Evelyn's weren't sharpened by fear. They were honed by experience, too honed for someone who'd known peace. That night, as dusk folded into darkness, Elijah silently pulled the rifle from its place above the hearth and checked the chamber. He loaded it slowly, deliberately, then leaned it by the front door where he could reach in a breath. There was no panic in his movements, just the heavy understanding of what might be coming. A few days later, Hannah Vale rode in from town, her horse laden with baskets of preserves and a face tight with unease. She dismounted briskly, brushing wind-blown hair from her brow. "Jasper Holt's been sniffing around again," she said, handing Elijah a jar. "Ask the postmaster if he's seen any new brides come through recently." The words hit like a dropped stone. Evelyn, standing nearby, went rigid, her breath catching mid-motion. Elijah's gaze darkened, jaw tensing. "He find out she's here?" he asked. Hannah glanced around before lowering her voice. "Maybe not yet, but when men like him start asking questions, it's best to be ahead of the answer." Her tone held no doubt, only warning. That evening, as shadows danced across the walls from the flickering hearth, Elijah found Evelyn alone by the fire, her hands clutching a letter already creased and stained with hesitation. The seal was gone, burned. She stared at it for a long time before casting it into the flames. The paper curled and blackened, vanishing without a sound. "Who was it from?" Elijah asked, voice low. Evelyn's shoulders tightened. "A man I thought I'd never see again, so I could still come back. That he'd forgive the shame I caused." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled faintly. Elijah's mouth set in a hard line. "You're not going anywhere." At that, she turned sharply, anger flashing across her features. "You don't owe me, Elijah." He didn't flinch. "I know that, but I also know you're not safe out there, and I can keep you safe here." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't want to be kept like a secret." He stepped closer, his voice softened now, but firm. "Then stay as something else." She blinked, uncertain. "Like what?" He held her gaze. "Like a woman I respect." The words landed between them like a vow, quiet and absolute. For a breathless moment, She stared at him as if he'd handed her something too fragile and precious to hold. Later that night, long after the fire had gone to embers, Elijah stirred at the sound of something outside. A faint scrape, too deliberate to be the wind. He rose from bed, rifle in hand, and eased the door open. The cold met him like a slap. Moonlight washed the yard in silver. Then he saw it. Movement, a figure slipping behind the barn. He moved quickly, breath steaming, boots thudding across frozen ground. He rounded the corner, rifle raised, but the space was empty. No intruder. Only footprints, fresh and human, leading off toward the creek, swallowed by darkness. When he returned to the house, Evelyn stood at the threshold, the kerosene lamp trembling in her grip. Her eyes met his, and she didn't ask what he saw. She already knew. "They're not here to steal livestock," she said quietly. "They're here for me." Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to. The next morning, Elijah worked without pause. He nailed thick boards across the windows, hammer striking wood with the kind of force that made a point. The doors were reinforced with crossbars and iron latches. Every weak point sealed like a promise. He didn't say much, but his actions shouted what he wouldn't let slip. They were no longer waiting. They were preparing. He sent word through Hannah, quiet but firm. If the judge wants to come, he better come with proof, not lies. Hannah returned hours later, dust on her coat and worry in her eyes. "He's not a man of law anymore," she warned. "He's a man with a badge and private guns." The line between law and vengeance had blurred, and everyone knew which side Jasper Holt stood on now. That evening, as dusk melted into quiet, Evelyn sat by the window, her face lit by fading orange light, gaze fixed beyond the glass. Her voice, when it came, was low. "I used to dream about being rescued," she whispered, more to the shadows than to him. "But now I just want to fight." Elijah stepped beside her without hesitation, the distance between them closing like a drawn curtain. "Then fight beside me," he said. Her fingers tightened around the windowsill. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." His answer was immediate, steady. "You've survived worse than bullets." She turned toward him, eyes searching. "So have you." And in that moment, neither of them flinched. Their hands found each other, not by mistake, not out of need, but with deliberate understanding. Callous palms, scarred and honest, met in the stillness. She didn't pull away. He didn't let go. Later, the fire hissed low in the hearth, shadows stretching long across the floor. From the kitchen, Elijah watched her move. She wore the same dress she had on the day they met, still patched at the elbow, still plain as dirt, but it didn't hang the same. There was a strength to her now, a defiance in every step, a flicker behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. She wasn't louder. She wasn't softer. She was just more, wilder, sharper, and entirely her own. He didn't know if she'd ever be his, not in the way men like to claim. But he knew, without doubt, that she was no longer the woman Silas Crow had traded away like spoiled goods. She was becoming something else, someone else. And if danger was coming, Elijah almost pitied the fool who thought she could be broken again. Hell, help the man who underestimated Evelyn Darmoy twice. The first warning didn't come with a knock or a telegram. It came with the wind. It wasn't the usual dry gust that swept through the plains. It was a strange, low hum that stirred the wheat in uneasy waves. Evelyn stood by the window, arms folded across her chest, her eyes locked on the horizon. The stillness in her face, the tension in her shoulders, these spoke louder than any alarm. Elijah didn't need to ask if she felt it too. He simply rose from his chair and began loading the rifle. By noon, a trail of dust unraveled on the north road. It was too slow, too steady for traders, and too deliberate to be chance. By evening, the shapes of 3 riders came into view, the fading sun glinting off metal at their hips. Elijah walked out to meet them, boots grinding the dry earth. The man in the center wore a bowler hat pulled low, his coat cleaner than trail life allowed. Everything about him was polished, his waxed mustache, his oiled voice. "You Elijah?" he asked. Elijah kept his hand near the gatepost. "Depends who's asking." The man dismounted slowly, theatrically. "I represent a man of great legal concern. He's reclaiming property wrongly taken." Elijah's hand tightened on the wood. "She ain't property, and she's not here against her will." The man's smile stayed, but his eyes sharpened. "Well, you see, her name's still on a legal writ. Jasper Holt's marriage claim, to be precise. That makes her his wife, far as the law's concerned." Elijah's voice turned to stone. "She never agreed to that. Paper don't care about agreement," the man replied with a shrug. From the porch, Evelyn's voice rang out like a rifle crack. "You tell him I'd rather be buried beneath this ranch than chained to that man again." The grin slid off the visitor's face. He looked back at the other two riders, then turned back to Elijah. "We'll return tomorrow with more persuasive arguments." Elijah stepped forward just enough. "Come again, and you'll leave lighter than you arrived." They rode off without another word, but their presence left a pressure behind, thick as smoke. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He walked the fence line with the rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes scanning the dark for movement. This wasn't the kind of fight he'd chosen, but it was the one he'd finish. Inside the house, Evelyn kept to herself the next day. She worked from dawn until near dark, fixing the fence line, splitting wood, swiping sweat from her brow like she could drive out dread through grit alone. Hannah Vale arrived in the afternoon, saddlebags full, her eyes never resting in one place too long. "They're saying Jasper Holt's paying bounty money to men who don't care about lines, legal or otherwise." Elijah only nodded. "He won't send messengers next time. He'll come himself." After Hannah rode off, Evelyn lingered beside the barn, leaning against a post like it was the only thing holding her up. "He'll bring more than threats," she said quietly. Elijah didn't hesitate. "I'll bring more than words." She turned her head, her expression shadowed but clear. "I should go." "No," Elijah said firmly. "You don't understand. He doesn't stop. He doesn't forgive. He finds cracks in people and widens them until they break." Elijah's voice dropped to something colder, heavier. "Let him come. I've lived too long with ghosts. I'm ready to face something that bleeds." For a long moment, Evelyn didn't speak. She just looked at him, not with fear this time, but with something steadier. Something that, for the first time, resembled belief. As dusk melted into deepening shadow, Elijah stepped into the parlor and found Evelyn seated in the quiet, her hands clutching a worn leather journal, as if it might vanish. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, the spine cracking with age and memory. "My mother wrote in this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, before she disappeared. Her eyes didn't lift as she turned the pages. "She told me to stay sharp, to read everything, and to learn a man's language, how they write, how they twist truth." Her fingers paused on a page. "She was gone before I turned 10. Left or was taken. No one ever said. Either way, I was alone." She held the journal out to Elijah, her hands steadying as he took it. Inside were delicate, dried wildflowers pressed between entries, rough sketches of places unnamed, and a line scrawled in slanted, careful ink. "Teach her to speak softly, but never let her forget the sharpness of silence." Elijah stared at the words, then at the woman who had lived them. "She'd like you," he murmured. Evelyn exhaled slowly. "I don't know if I'm still someone she'd recognize." He looked up steady. "You're stronger than what they try to make you." That's something she'd never miss. The next night came thick with unease. From the porch, they saw the glow before they heard the hooves. 6 riders, 1 carriage, fire flickering like a threat across the open dark. Elijah and Evelyn stood in the doorway, shoulders aligned, the wind cold enough to bite. Even the chickens were silent. Dust shifted under their boots, brittle as bone. From the carriage stepped a man cloaked in arrogance, his sash marking a title no longer backed by law. His boots gleamed in the firelight. His voice rang out, polished and poisonous. "Evelyn," he called, "you've had your freedom. Now you'll return with me." She didn't waver. "I'm not yours. I never was." He scoffed. "I paid your father. He signed a writ. You're mine." Elijah took a step forward, his voice low and hard. "She's my wife now." Jasper Holt's lip curled. "Not legally." Elijah didn't flinch. "Then the law's slower than bullets." The night cracked open with gunfire. The first shot missed. The second splintered wood beside Elijah's head. He fired back without pause. One rider dropped. Evelyn, moving as if memory had returned to her hands, ducked and grabbed the spare rifle. Her aim was clean, deliberate. One man screamed, clutching his shoulder, his horse bolting into the dark. The porch became a battlefield. Elijah took a hit to the ribs, gritted through the pain, kept moving. Evelyn, out of ammunition, didn't hesitate. She grabbed a shovel. When a rider surged up the steps, she met him with a full swing, knocking him down hard. Flames licked across the barn's edge from a dropped torch. Smoke twisted into the sky. Screams faded. One by one, they fell or fled, until only Jasper Holt remained, face red, pistol trembling in his grip. "You think this ends here?" he shouted, fury in his spit. Elijah, blood tracing a line down his temple, stepped forward, rifle heavy in his hand. "You want her?" he said, voice ragged. "Take her." Beside him, Evelyn moved, not behind him, not sheltered, but beside. Her rifle was down, but her eyes weren't. Jasper Holt looked at her then, really looked. And in her face, he didn't find fear. He found the one thing he couldn't control: choice. Her gaze didn't flinch. She was no man's possession. Not anymore. Not ever again. Jasper Holt stepped back, retreating to the carriage, his threats trailing behind him like smoke. "You'll hang for this." Elijah's voice followed, a low growl. "You'll be dead before the rope's tied." As the dust swallowed the carriage's retreat, Evelyn turned to Elijah. Her hands shook from adrenaline, but her voice held like steel. "I'm not running anymore." He looked at her, something warm stirring beneath the bruises. "Good," he said. "I built this place with 2 hands and silence. But now I'd rather build it with someone who speaks her mind." She reached up, fingertips brushing the blood on his cheek. "You're bleeding," she said. He caught her wrist gently. "So are you." They stood amid ash and gunpowder, the porch scorched, the barn still smoldering. And between them, something unspoken settled, stronger than any vow inked in a church, steadier than rings or titles. It had been forged in fire, and it would hold.